Thank you very much for coming to my talk. I'm going to be talking on a variety of subjects. I'm going to be talking about HTML5, Glassfish, and NetBeans. My name is Mark Stevens. As you may have gathered from my voice, I come from the UK. I speak English. I get very excited in my talks and quite often tend to talk quickly. So if I talk too quickly, please shout out, let me know, and I will slow down. Okay, I'd like to introduce myself first. This is how I like to see myself. I think the rest of the development team see me more like this. I suspect the truth lies somewhere between the middle. I am an entrepreneur, and I'm a founder of a UK-based company called IDR Solutions. Thankfully, I now have some better people to write the code for me, so I still write some code, but I have some much smarter people to help me do all the clever stuff. I am the systems architect for two products. What we do is we have a Java library that we wrote to display PDF files, and that has been quite a challenge to write. We have lots of people using that. I'm particularly proud that one of our customers is a company you might have heard of called Adobe that uses our PDF converter in a product called Cold Fusion. So it was quite nice to take something that Adobe invented and actually sell it back to them. And we also do conversion of PDF to HTML5. So I've spent the last 3 years taking apart HTML5 files, taking apart browsers, trying to work out how they work, and I'm going to share some of that with you today. I am actually only 23, I just look really old because of all of the HTML5 issues. I have done talks before. I did a talk at a Business of Software conference, which is organised by Redgate, where I talked about the software industry, and I did a talk involving lots of dinosaur and kitten pictures called Are You an Asteroid Impact? Are You a Large Lizard or Small and Furry? Where I talked about what it's like running a small software company trying to be agile. I've also done talks at Java 1. We're regular people there. We have a stand there. We talk there. We go and find out what's happening at Java 1. And we go to all the parties. So you may have met me around. And I do user group talks as well. I was in Brussels last year for a Brussels user group. I did the iTech summit. So if people ask me to talk, I turn up and talk. I don't get out of the office enough, so I do try and get away. I work a lot of the time on PDF, HTML5 and SVG, ripping these things apart, writing them, coding them. So I'm going to share a whole load of stuff I've discovered about that with you. I make extensive uses of web technologies and Java, but it's not just going to be about Java, this talk. Very little of it's to do with Java. A lot of it's about HTML5 web technologies. And I also have a degree in medieval history. Most talks, this is the point where I get to say how useless that is. But actually, I would like to thank you for inviting me to Istanbul, because my speciality in medieval history is early Byzantine history and Ottoman history. So I actually arrived yesterday, and I spent the whole day going around all the monuments, seeing all the places I'd learnt about. So it actually has finally, after all these years, given me a practical use. So thank you very much for inviting me to Istanbul, anytime. The talk will consist of an introduction to HTML5 SVG, why we use it, what's good about it, what's not. I'm going to do some interactive demos. The university firewall is blocking my Glassfish, so I've had to change that slightly. I'm going to include lots of hints and tips. I'm going to have a slot for questions at the end. And I have a confession to make, in that if you've seen one of my talks before, they tend to end up with lots of kitten pictures in them. Particularly our cats. My daughter likes me to include kitten pictures, so I would apologize for that in advance. Are you understanding me? Am I speaking okay? Okay. If you go and talk at a conference, you always have to have an official disclaimer. And Oracle's disclaimer, I think, runs to 4,000 words, and is basically there because the legal people say that you have to avoid being sued for anything, which Oracle spends a lot of time either suing people or being sued by people is important to them. So we like to have an official disclaimer, which more or less means the same. So if I claim to have mentioned that you can use our product for free, or that HTML5 does this, or anything like that, I will deny it. Okay. So that's our video, that's our disclaimer, and obviously no kittens were harmed or neglected during the making of this presentation. Okay, HTML5. Who's currently using HTML5? Let's have a display of hands. Okay, a few people. Who's using HTML5 and no other version of HTML5? Okay, interesting. HTML5 is an open standard. That means that you can go to the W3C conference, you can make suggestions about it, you can download the spec, you can have endless arguments about how it should work, but it is out in the open. No single company controls it. It has lots of support, especially on mobile. If you're going to launch one of these days and you don't have a decent web browser on it, people won't buy it. So a lot of HTML5 support is being driven by the need to have decent mobile support. It's also backwards compatible, so you can write HTML5 in a way that will work on XHTML, HTML4, even HTML3.2 browsers. The key features of HTML5 are as follows, and I'm going to give you a list. I'm not going to cover all of them, but I want to list them for you. First of all, you've got JavaScript, which means you can write code that controls your pages. You can verify data, you can control animations, you can check that the user has entered the right sort of files. So you can write a lot of business logic client-side, you can write games client-side. HTML5 is not just about display, you can write code in it as well, so long as you're happy to write it in JavaScript. It's dynamic, it can be updated. The JavaScript can update values. You can also actually update it from the server. So those days when I started web technologies, you had to refresh the screen if you wanted to show something. Now the HTML5 pages can update themselves in real time without any user interaction. It has CSS support. You can have nice colorful text, you can have careful line spacing, you can have really good looking pages. And you've got full support for CSS for doing that. It also has location functionality built in, so that if you're using HTML5 to display a map and your device has location information available, it can display where you are on the map, which is pretty cool. The days where HTML5 needed a constant internet connection are gone, so you can write applications which have limited capabilities even if offline. It has SVG supported. SVG is quite an old technology. Many people regarded SVG as the technology of the future and was always going to be the technology of the future. The problem SVG had was that there were, I think, 2 tools that allowed you to create SVG, one of which was Inkscape. Nobody used SVG because there were no tools, so no support was available for SVG, and so it got into a vicious circle. Because SVG is now part of the HTML5 spec, suddenly it's got support. And for a number of applications, SVG is actually better than HTML5. And I'm going to show you some screenshots, I'm going to show you some actual SVG and talk about where we use SVG and where we use HTML5. You also have within the HTML5 what's called the HTML5 canvas. That is a surface that you can draw onto. You can run animations, you can even write games. On most browsers, it's using hardware acceleration with OpenGL, so you can get fast animation, flicker-free graphics, all within HTML5. So you will see a lot of games being written using the HTML5 canvas, and you can program it from JavaScript as well. You can also embed video content, and when you embed video content, you don't have to download the video until the user uses it. So you've got a video command in the HTML, you can have very small files, you only actually take the hit on the download if and when the user chooses to download video. You can also have inlining and base64. HTML5 is very flexible. You can have external files for your CSS, JavaScript fonts, or you can actually embed them in the single HTML file. And if you're embedding images and fonts, you can use base64. The reason why you might want to do this is if you are making secure connections, each connection will need verification, so it may well be faster to include all the information in the HTML5 file, so it will load faster across the secure connection. Okay, so I've talked about how good it looks. Let's have some practical examples. Okay, when I was deciding what to do, what we do is we have a PDF converter, and we spend a lot of time trying to reproduce files in HTML5. So let's give you some examples and see how good HTML5 can do. So that is a page, it's got foreign text, it's got graphics, it's got shapes on it. Okay, and let's open the HTML5 equivalent. And as you can see, it's actually pretty good. And let's actually go into HTML5, show you a bit of HTML5. One of the really useful things about all the browsers is you can actually open up the content, you can inspect it. So let's have a look at that element for the word self-assessment. You can see that, if you haven't seen it before, HTML5 is a text markup language, and I can actually, within the HTML5 browser, edit it. And I can also play around with the tags. So I can actually switch things on, off. I can play with the font size. Let's make that text a bit smaller. So if you are debugging fonts, it's a really useful way to be, if you're debugging HTML5, it's really useful to be able to get in and play with it. And you will now see I've got a tiny hello world there. So does a pretty good job of him showing it off. Let's look at some other examples. Okay. Here we have a Arabic page with right to left text. And I've included this to show you how good HTML5 does of foreign fonts. There it is. You guys can probably read this better than me because I'm not familiar with these types of script. One of the interesting things about the browsers is they've actually detected it's Arabic, as you can see at the top of the browser, and they are offering me the chance to translate it. And when we wrote this originally, because the browsers are fairly clever, what we actually found was the text was reversed, because the browser spotted that Arabic's right to left, so it actually reversed the text in the display. So what you can actually do within HTML5 is you can tell it that you want it to display the text in a certain layout. So you can either leave HTML5 to do all the work, or as you can see here, I've actually got a tag that tells you up at the top right that the direction is left to right. Sometimes HTML5 is too clever for its own good. Okay, let's go to a final example. Okay. Here we have a page with some fairly sophisticated text layout from an anonymous British bank. And let's have a look. As you can see, you can't always get HTML5 to be perfect compared to something like PDF, but it does a pretty good job for most files. And again, I could go in and edit it. And I can select the text, I can move across lines. Another really nice feature of HTML5 is, if I zoom into it, you will see that that image has pixelated, whereas the text within the HTML5 browser is still very crisp. So a nice feature of HTML5 is it will re-render the text at the appropriate screen resolution. Okay, so there's the page again. I've got that to talk about a later issue. In fact, I'll cover it now. That would be better. One of the things that I will mention about HTML5, which is the standard problem you have in every programming language, is that, okay, can you see I have selected there, I've got each line in a div, I have selected across the divs, so you can see the text is highlighted. That works perfectly in HTML5, unless you try to do that in an iPad. So something I will be talking about in more detail later is that there are differences in the way HTML5 works on different browsers. If I try to do that text selection on an iPad, on exactly the same HTML5, it will select both lines for me, which is a real pain. Okay, so are you impressed with how well HTML5 looks? No? Okay, let's talk about HTML5 versus SVG. And again, I'm going to give you an example and I'm going to show you some HTML5 content. So, that is here is an HTML5 page. And I'm going to zoom into it. Okay, and you can see, let's take the page down so you can see it properly. Okay, so that's the HTML5 page, and down the bottom we've got some text. Sorry, we've got some graphic shapes. And what we've actually done there, let's go and have a look at that, is you can see, even as we continue to scale into it, it's still really crisp. Okay, and I have a confession to make, is that that's not actually HTML5. You can do it in HTML5, but we actually find that HTML5 does not look as good as SVG, and we've found a number of our customers are actually using SVG for complex layout. So let's just show you what some SVG looks like. That's SVG. It's an XML style format, and you can see we've got clip paths, we've got shapes. You can open it in a text editor, you can read it, you can edit it. And what we're actually doing for this page is we are generating a background image with the images and the shapes on, and we're also generating an SVG. If you remember earlier, I said that SVG is part of the HTML spec. So one of the nice things about HTML is where SVG is useful, you can actually use the SVG inside the HTML5. And the reason we're using SVG there is because it gives better quality output. We are not using HTML Canvas, and I'm going to explain why in another slide. Okay, so let's talk about HTML and SVG. If you're doing animation in HTML5, use HTML5 Canvas. It's fast, it's got hardware acceleration, it was designed for that. If you're writing games, HTML5 is the thing to use. If you're using forms or interactive content, checkboxes and so forth, again, you can embed forms in SVG. When you embed forms in SVG, you actually embed a foreign object, so you're embedding HTML5 inside SVG. So you can have SVG inside HTML5 and HTML5 inside SVG, if that makes sense. We haven't yet tried doing HTML inside SVG inside HTML, because that's just getting silly. But one of the nice things about having both HTML5 and SVG is you can choose the better one. So for forms, stick to HTML5. Features, SVG has some really nice drawing features. You can get better text positioning, it handles shapes better. So, but it doesn't have animation, it doesn't have video. So again, features, choose the feature set that's appropriate for what you want to do. Support. In theory, they should both have the same level of support, but we have found that SVG is not quite as good on some of the devices as others. And the look, if you want really high quality output display, SVG is better, I would say. HTML Canvas I've mentioned. If you're writing games, it's the natural thing to use. If you need animations or you're controlling the animation, Canvas is fantastic. When we started writing HTML5, we thought we'd use Canvas because we put all the graphics content onto that. It doesn't actually offer any advantages for drawing static content. We found that it makes the files bigger, makes the files load slower. On some mobile devices, their files will actually crash. So what we do is if we want to load a file as fast as possible, we render a background image. If we want it to be scalable, we render SVG. And you can actually use JavaScript, so you can choose between the two options on different browsers, which is very useful. Okay, let's talk about how good HTML support is. IE 8 and before. I'm having a laugh, aren't I? IE 8 doesn't support HTML5, but if you don't make any use of the HTML5 specific features, you can write code that will run as HTML5 and will run reasonably well on IE 8. Your biggest problem with the IE 8 browser is that you produce a horrible, boring version of your page for IE 8, and then you produce a really nice, sexy page with lots of animation for the iPad, and your IE 8 users complain that they want all of that functionality in IE 8. And then you tell them to upgrade to an Android or an iPad device. So long as they don't want the specific HTML5 support features, like location, animation, and so forth, you can write really good code that works. IE 9 and 10 both have reasonable HTML5 support. It's not as good as Firefox, Chrome, and Safari. So if you have the choice of browsers and you're writing HTML5, those are the three to go to. It's worth knowing, though, that even though they release versions across multiple platforms, the code base and the libraries that they are using are different underneath. So you may find you get different behavior if you're viewing HTML5 in Firefox on an Android device compared to a Mac. You can't even guarantee that Safari works the same across multiple devices. I put iPad down as a separate case as well because I mentioned iPad earlier and the set text selection issue. And again, Android. If you are aiming to support the maximum number of platforms, there are lots of different types of fonts you can use. There is a type called WOFF and a type called EOT. Windows IE Explorer prefers EOT. Everything else works with WOFF, which is ironic as Microsoft was one of the people who created the WOFF spec. So HTML5 allows you to build in multiple fonts and include them, and the browser will choose them. So if you're aiming for maximum compatibility, you choose both. If you're just writing for the iPad, stick to WOFF. Important note for Mac users. If you are using a Mac, then you should upgrade to Mavericks, which is a free update, because all of the browsers will use the operating system code, not necessarily their own libraries. So we've had a number of bugs where we've been running the latest version of Chrome on our Macs, and we've had a customer running the latest version of Chrome on their Macs, and we are seeing different things. And the reason we had that is because they're running 10.7 and we're running 10.8. So all of the browsers will not necessarily work the same unless you're running the same operating system, because the library versions are different. Okay. Top 3 issues we had in HTML5. Any guesses? These are the nightmares that caused us problems. JavaScript, particularly timing issues. If you're writing JavaScript code and you want to do something clever like page turning, then you have to debug them on different devices. Fonts. We build a lot of our own custom fonts, and we actually had to create our own compiled version of Firefox to debug some of these. The browsers, again, use different libraries. What they regard as a valid font varies. So if you're using fonts and you want maximum support, make sure you're using well-known fonts, check they work. And the last one is implementation issues. Particularly, some browsers will support some HTML features, others won't. And some will support a feature with a floating point number, and other browsers will take the floating point number and round it up or down. It's never going to be 100% with HTML5. It's a bit like when I started Java, it was write once, debug everywhere. So, having said that, how good is it as a replacement for Flash? Flash, I would say, is a dead technology. It doesn't run on the Apple platform, and it's not being developed. So Flash is pretty much dead. HTML5 can do everything that Flash can do. I'm going to show you an example later with a page-turning document, which is one of the common uses for Flash. So if you're still using Flash, anyone still using Flash? You guys need to get into HTML5 fast. General web content. I've shown you some nice pages. HTML5 does a really good job on displaying pages, magazines, so forth. If you're interested, I've got loads of examples. I've got a desk on the 3rd floor. I'd be delighted to bore you with endless examples for the rest of the day. PDF files. I started working with PDF, and I have seen many formats claim that they will kill off PDF files, and PDF files are still here. HTML5 is the closest I've seen to anything that will kill off the PDF spec. For just displaying electronic content, it's fantastic. It doesn't have all the features that you want for printing, though. So if you're looking at printing and so forth, PDF still has a couple of tricks up its sleeves. I don't think I need to retire and start doing something non-PDF related for several years. Native apps. There is a lively debate between whether we write Android and iPad apps or whether we write HTML5 apps. HTML5 apps will never be 100%, so you may well have to debug them on certain platforms. That said, though, it's going to be a lot less hassle than having to write the iPad app in Objective-C and having to write a couple of Android apps in Android and then to debug all of them. So I still regard HTML5, even if you have to debug it for specific platforms, as a lot less work than writing native apps. It also means you can reach your customers directly. You can have Google Analytics running on in your app. You don't have to pay Apple 30% to go through the iStore. You don't have to get them to agree to your application. And when you're looking at minority platforms, such as BlackBerry, it means you can target those as well. Something that I've found very interesting in the last 12 months is a lot of companies, particularly where they have internal applications, are developing an application for the iPad or the iPhone, and then all their desktop users are switching to it as well, because normally it's better written, it's faster, and they can use just one application. So if you're developing apps, it may well be that you shouldn't just be thinking about the mobile applications, particularly if you're developing things for in-house. You can actually, with one application, replace your desktop development product and have a nicer application for your users. Okay, I'm now going to talk about NetBeans. Has anyone ever heard of NetBeans? Hands up. Okay, NetBeans is an IDE, so it's a development tool. And it's been around for 15 years in one form or another, so it has a fairly secure code base. It's actually being developed faster now than it is than in any time in its history. So you will see that there are regular releases on it. It is not just a Java, it's written in Java, but it's not just a Java IDE. You can use it for writing PHP. There is even, bizarrely enough, an Android plugin, which Oracle have allowed. There is HTML functionality, JavaScript, CSS, Python, C, C++, and you can also write your bash scripts in it. So it's a very versatile tool, and you can use one tool for all of these items. It's cross-platform, so we have it running on our Macs, our Linux boxes, our Windows boxes. You can even run it on the Raspberry Pi. One of the really nice features about it is it has out-of-the-box support for version control. If you've ever lost any documents or you've tried to work with other developers, you will appreciate version control. Version control means that I can store every version of my file on a remote server. The version control will merge any changes with anyone else's code. I can go back to any version instantly. If you're not using version control, the most critical takeaway you can have from this conference is to get into using it. Then you'll never lose anything ever again. I promise. You can come to the UK and tell me if you do. It's highly configurable. It has a lot of functionality built into it, but if you're a Vive fan or an Emacs fan, you can change all the keyboard shortcuts, and you can add your own keyboard shortcuts. And again, if you'd like to see that, come up and I will show you. It's also free, that favorite word that we all like these days. And it is being heavily supported by Oracle. Oracle is the £800, or one of the big £800 gorillas currently, or has just been attempting to sue Google over Android. They are spending an awful lot of money developing NetBeans, and they are giving it away for free. So you really want to take advantage of their generosity now. It's also a natural platform for a tool called Glassfish, which I'm going to show you with a demo. Glassfish is an application server, and this is what you'll see if you go to their website. So what does this really mean? Well, first of all, Glassfish is a really, really stupid name for it, because obviously it's got nothing to do with glass, and surprisingly. And it gave me another excuse to have a kitten picture in it as well. So, Glassfish consists of the following. There is a server program that you can run on your internet servers. You can also run it on your local machine to debug it. You can then have it attached. You can then connect to this server program via one or more client programs. So I can have it running on my Google Glasses, I could have it running on my phone, I could have it running on my tablet, I could even have it running on a PC or the Raspberry Pi. If you haven't heard of the Raspberry Pi, that's another thing that you should investigate. And what these applications can do is they can talk to each other. So my application here I can allow the user to select a file. I can upload the file from my phone onto the Glassfish server. In our case, you can convert the file, send the contents back to the user. And as I said, you can run it all on the development single machine for testing. So what Glassfish really is it's a magic door. It allows you to write a client program, server program. It takes care of all of the communications. It takes care of the security. On the server, it will also handle load balancing, clustering. So the application that you write, as it grows and grows into the next big thing on the internet, you can plug multiple servers into it. Glassfish will handle all of that for you. So it's a like portal or magic door that takes care of all of that functionality for you. And that's a nice picture with a rainbow. You might recognize the location. Okay, I'm going to do some demos now. So, let's have a look at NetBeans. Okay. So, here's NetBeans. I've fired it up. I can have multiple projects in it. I can also have different types of views. So I can see the files, I can see the services, I can add favorites, so make it easy to find files. What I've been doing here is, being a developer at heart, I've been busy coding away. So what I've also done is, because it's on version control, I can actually see what has changed since my last commit. So here you can see exactly what I've put into the code. I can go through the code, I can review the changes, I can commit them to version control. And all of that is built in automatically. All I have to do is to tell it where the server repository is. If it's a Google, SourceForge or whatever, I can connect to it. Files will go straight into it. I've got a lot of functionality in terms of refactoring, editing, navigating, debugging even, and that's all available for HTML5, JavaScript, Java, so I can actually debug my applications. Let's create a new application. The demo gods, of course. So we fire it back up, hopefully. This, of course, only ever happens when you're doing a demo. I'll just check whether it's loaded it. Nope. Okay, let's relaunch it. Okay, I shall kill it off. Okay, I will skip that bit because NetBeans has decided for the first time with immaculate timing that it's going to play up. So I might come back to the end or come onto the stand. But I have had it up and running all day. Okay, I'd like to do a demo also on NetBeans on HTML replacing Flash. And here's an interesting little page. What a lot of companies are using HTML5 for is to replace Flash. And traditionally it was something like page turning, and that's why they were using Flash. But of course HTML5 can't do anything like that. As you can see, there's absolutely no capability for doing anything terribly clever in HTML5. But what's also incredibly useful in HTML5, of course, is that's all pure text, so Google can see that. We can get SEO on it. And because we're in HTML5, we can have the ability to interact with the rest of the web. So we can do Twitter, we can do Facebook, and so forth. And we can zoom out, we can zoom in. So HTML5, as you can see, is more than capable of replacing Flash. Okay, an interesting use that I also have had is that we had a teacher who actually wrote to us to thank us for having a free online converter, because what they were doing was they were taking stories, they were working with children one-to-one. They were taking, he was writing stories that the children were then reading through, and he couldn't use any plugins on his application. He could only use a web browser. So what he was doing was taking the PDF stories, converting them into HTML5, and that was allowing him to, and then within the browser, the children will be able to read along to it. So that works really nicely. And the other thing I was going to show you is this is our blog. We have a professor teaches pharmacology at the University of Mississippi. And what he's done is he's taken the converter and he's actually built a converter so that his students can upload their work, and he can actually have an online discussion with his students. So he can point out things to them in the content, and they can review their work, discuss their work and the whole thing works online. So he's converting the PDFs into HTML5, and then he's using a tool called JS Annotator, which allows him to control the annotations. So there's an awful lot of functionality you can build on top of HTML5. Okay, let's see if my NetBeans wants to work. We'll give it one more chance. No. Okay, so I've given you an awful lot of hopefully useful hints and tips. I've talked about NetBeans. It does genuinely work. Only on demos does it fall over. It has a special mode that's been added. So I would like to wish you some happy developing with your code. Thank you for inviting me. And do you have any questions? Sorry? Yep. For pure static pages, there isn't a great advantage. The advantage is you can develop the static pages as part of dynamic content. What I was going to show you as part of the NetBeans content is you can actually write pages in what's called JSP, which is a bit like PHP, which allows you to include dynamic elements within the content. And you can actually write code in Java, which outputs HTML5. So there's no big advantage other than the fact you'd get load balancing off the Glassfish. But it does mean that you can mix and match dynamic content. A lot of static pages you actually start with, you actually want to end up putting dynamic content in. There are very few websites that are pure static content. In Glassfish. Glassfish itself is to some extent agnostic to search engines, so it doesn't do anything with the search engines. There's no reason why you can't add your own sitemap, but you have to build it manually. Any other questions? Okay. I am here all day if you'd like to come and visit me, and I've got some useful links up there. Yes.
Kim soruyor?
Thank you very much for your talk. I'm wondering, so if I develop something in HTML5,
Yes.
it is quite, so the source is basically all there in the page source. So what can I do what are the general good practice for obfuscating my code? Because I've seen lots of HTML5 apps where I can practically just take the source code and make it my own. And when I spend a lot of time developing something, I want to somehow make it impossible for others to copy, basically.
You can put it inside a zip file and compress it. You can also make sure, you can also run essentially a compressor on it. So it actually takes the code and squeezes it down, so it's actually just a huge block of code. You can also essentially inline the content, so you can write code that's fairly unreadable. If you run it through, there are various open source compressors. That would be the first suggestion, is because it's then much harder for anyone to read and debug it. If you put it in external files as well, it's much harder for anyone to access the content.
But then how easy will it be for someone to sort of go back from the obfuscated version to the original version? I mean, is this something that people tend to think about? For example, if I just run a code obfuscator, I can still sort of go back and steal the code quite easily. I mean, these are people
steal the code. It's a bit like reverse engineering any code, though. The person who would, if you've done a decent job of locking it down and there's no comments, and it will also convert the variable names, so you won't actually have any meaningful variable names. The only person who would really be able to understand it is the sort of person who could write it for themselves anyway.
Okay, thanks.
It's a standard security issue. Every code or encryption can be broken. You're just trying to make sure it's essentially not worth breaking.
Thank you.
I have a question about Glassfish. Why you are using Glassfish for that project, or why don't you choose a solid container, just like Tomcat or like Jetty? Why you need some EGB container like Glassfish for developing a HTML5 website?
You can develop HTML5 webs on, I mean, you can use Tomcat, you can use Jetty.
Yeah, but Glassfish is really slower than Jetty and Tomcat because of the EGB container. Why you choose Glassfish?
It's a selection of reasons for using Glassfish. Partly it's to do with the fact it's load balancing, partly it's to do with the fact it lets us mix and match content.
Are you using EGB for your websites?
Not at the moment. We're using JSP and servlets, but we're rewriting a lot of it.
So you don't need a EGB container?
No.
I don't get the point. Why are you choosing Glassfish?
Why not?
Because it's heavier. You know, it's heavier than other solid containers. It's really slow and configuration is really hard, and it's a big headache.
We've found that something like Tomcat, you can write things probably closer to the metal. What you're getting in Glassfish is a lot of configurability. I mean, different uses of Glassfish different web apps you might want to develop on different platforms. When we originally used Tomcat, we found Tomcat to be quite buggy and would fall over on our hardware. So that was one of the reasons we switched to Glassfish. I mean, the nice thing about open source is there are essentially 5 different web containers, and you can choose which one you want. So there will always be people who prefer Tomcat, some people who are using Glassfish.
Because of some issues, it's clear that we can take 100% advantage of HTML5. So how long do you think it takes to use it without any hesitation, using the HTML5 without any hesitation, like Flash has been doing for years? Thank you.
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Sure. It's clear that we can take 100% advantage from HTML5
yes.
because of some issues that you mentioned before. And how long do you think it takes to use it without any hesitation?
How good HTML5 is to you is going to be driven essentially by the user base you're targeting. We still find there are an awful lot of people using IE6. So if your requirement is essentially backwards compatibility with different browsers, then IE5 is not worth bothering with yet. If you're looking at releasing a new game on, say, the iPad or the Android app, IE5 support is excellent. So it really depends on which browsers you are targeting. The problems you will get with HTML5 is if it's not a magic solution to every platform. And as I said earlier, if you're not careful, you find that your IE6 users are expecting the same user interaction and features that you're able to offer your Android or your iPad users. So it's really down to which platforms you want to support what you're trying to do. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
So when we code a website with JavaScript and HTML5 using CSS3 and canvases, and we usually obtain our information by Ajax using HTTP processes.
Yes.
How can we make this website more search engine friendly, or is it already search engine friendly?
Do you have a sitemap attached to the files? Because what you would tend to do is in this file, for example, we've got Ajax that's loading the content. If I view the page source, again, to the other gentleman on JavaScript, the more you make your code external, the more complicated it will be for people to copy it. So this is HTML5. We've got the title and we've got the standard analytics code. Got the site. No, I need to go. I'm just looking for the sitemap. We have a sitemap in the file. No, we're loading it via Ajax. But if you add what is it on the page? It's on the pages. What we're doing is we can dynamically get the Ajax to load the sitemap. And you can you can manually submit that to Google as well. Have you got text on the pages or not?
Hello. Hello.
I'm an iOS developer. For mobile platforms, is for freelance projects.
Yep.
Supporting multiple platforms is a big issue because I'm developing in Objective-C.
Yep.
But in feature, the tries showed us the HTML5 and mobile devices are not so ready because of performance issues. What were the drawbacks? Is the problem solved? Should we start to learn HTML5? Developing HTML5, and was it from HTML5 drawbacks or hardware problems?
The main issue you've got on HTML5 is it's an open standard which has been implemented independently by different companies. So Google's idea of what the HTML5 spec means will be slightly different from what Safari or Apple's are. So if you're using particularly things like line spacing, we use to try and get an exact match on PDF files, we're trying to be very precise with the line spacing command, and some of the browsers are interpreting that as an int value, and some of them are interpreting it as a float value. Which obviously means you get slightly different results. And again, if you want to run it on IE doesn't support WAF fonts until the latest versions. A lot of the issues are also essentially minor timing issues. So when you run JavaScript, we actually have a different set of JavaScript with the page turning. We have a different set of JavaScript for the page turning for Android devices as opposed to HTML, as opposed to the iPad. So there are still, as I said, it's like Java where you write some code and then you add blocks for different cases. So there are still issues when you're trying to do something particularly clever like animation or accessing the Ajax DOM or whatever. Generally, for low-level HTML5, simple commands, the support's excellent. You also have, if you go to Safari, when you scale into the canvas, another thing that we discovered is on some versions of Safari, the canvas is redrawn, whereas on other versions of Safari, the canvas is treated as an image, and the image is just scaled, so you get different functionality. So you've got all these minor niggles on HTML5 that you just need to have basically discovered and be aware of. But having said that, if you're going to write an application for iPad and Android, if you were going to write that as a web app, you'd have to have one version of Objective-C, you'd have to have the Android app developed as well, you'd have to be debugging multiple Android libraries on different devices because 4.2, 4.3 KitKat don't work the same way. So you've got some annoying issues in HTML5, but I would say they are a lot less than having to support multiple code versions of the product. Does that answer your question? It also means that if, say, one of the issues some of our customers have is that we have people with BlackBerries. BlackBerry is like 5% of the market. But on the other hand, a lot of very important CEOs are using BlackBerries. So are we going to write our own BlackBerry application as well? So particularly with these minority platforms, we can have a reasonable HTML5 app which covers most of them, giving us a much better spread, as opposed to saying, okay, we've got the iPad app, are we then going to write the same code in Android, and then what are we going to do about these other devices? So I would say there are issues, but the issues are not as much as having multiple code bases in different languages written across them. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? If you'd like to try our converter, there is a free version on our website which you can fire up. And I would be delighted to, I'm going to go and reboot my machine now. I would be delighted to show you NetBeans. I'd be delighted to talk about any aspect of HTML5, PDFs, SVG, web technologies, Glassfish, or even iconoclasm in the early Byzantine Empire. Please feel free to come and ask me any questions.